Thank you, Sarah, and earlier thanks, Jeff, for introductory remarks. This is a time when we need Fabian-type approaches using knowledge, public education, recognising that good things in public policy take a long time, require consistency over long periods of time. We haven't had much of these things lately, and it really shows. My book, published in February this year, Reset, Australia After the Pandemic Recession, began as 6 lectures in the middle of the pandemic, electronically, from under the tree of knowledge in Barcaldine. My wife Jane and I, when the shutters were coming down and our friends in the medical school in Melbourne told us it was going to be a pretty bad winter, quickly put our things in the car and drove north and managed to get over the borders before everything shut. And we had friends in Barcaldine, so we spent 9 months in last year, 2020, in Barcaldine, and through the University of Melbourne, I gave 6 lectures on the pandemic and what its implications were for our economy and what we could do to get it to make life better after it. And those 6 public lectures are the book. Barcaldine, of course, is the birthplace of the Australian Labor Party. People in Balmain pretend it was the wharfies of Balmain who started it, but if you look at the dates very carefully, it was actually the shearers in the strike of 1891 who got it started. Beneath the feet of the people who still live in Barcaldine is the world's richest coal resource, now starting to be mined by an Indian chap called Adani, and a little mine, but then very big mines, truly consequential ones, owned by less famous figures, or at least less famous for their mining in Barcaldine, Clive Palmer and Gina Rinehart. But I think it was the environmental movement deciding that a fat Indian was an easier target than people who fund the political parties of Australia. So Adani became much more famous for his coal mining than Gina and Clive did. But the very first of the public lectures through my faculty at Melbourne, we had one consequence of COVID is that we've got these wonderful platforms that huge numbers of people can plug into, and there were 1,000 people online, and the clock ticked to 5 o'clock when I was supposed to start speaking in the first lecture, and the power went off in the town. After 10 clumsy minutes it came on again, and I was able to say I looked forward to the time when reliable power was supplied by the world's best sun resource above our head in Barcaldine rather than the coal beneath our feet. The theme of Reset, of the lectures and now of the book, is of the importance of knowledge in public policy. And of course I was taking my cue from the tree of knowledge. I remarked in the first lecture that while Prime Minister Keating, in an expansive moment, once regretted the fact that Australia had not had legendary leaders like Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt, I remarked that it actually was a triumph of our history that our legendary moments celebrated the knowledge and alternatives to violence as a way of solving deep societal and political differences. At the time of the lectures, Australia was experiencing the deepest, sharpest downturn in our economic history. In the first quarter, we'd had a decline in economic activity. That's not the pandemic. That's the accumulated underperformance of the economy and bushfires. But the second quarter was the pandemic. Economic activity fell 6.5%. We've never had a fall anything like that in our history. The government's response to that was extraordinary, especially given the ideological framework in which public policy had been articulated by the Morrison governments and its predecessors, Turnbull and Abbott. We engaged on the largest, quickest Keynesian fiscal and monetary expansion we've ever had. And that was just starting as I was giving the lectures. I think Australia was very fortunate that a well-trained economist, PhD out of the ANU, in the old days when I was there, Stephen Kennedy was Secretary of the Treasury, gave very good advice to the government, and the government took it. In those crisis circumstances, the introduction of JobKeeper, JobSeeker made a huge difference to the way Australians came through that first year. The soundness of policy didn't continue into the second year. But the question I was posing back in the middle of 2020 is, what do we do after this sharp break? When you get an economic downturn as severe as that, and it was very severe, there's nothing like it for such a sudden decline in activity and employment in our history. It provides an opportunity to look at what you're doing and to change things. And of course we did that with that fiscal and monetary expansion, but it was an opportunity to look more generally at what was going right and what was going wrong. That recession in the first half of last year ended the longest period of economic expansion without recession that any developed country has ever had. The longest in our own history by far, but longer than any other developed country had ever had. And we'd had unbroken economic expansion back to the recession of 1991. But it wasn't a uniformly good 28 years of expansion. And I divided the period up into the first decade, what I call a productivity boom, from the end of the recession to 2002, where Australian output per person and economic productivity rose more rapidly than any other developed country. After 9 decades through the 20th century, when on average our productivity growth was the lowest of all developed countries. So that was a remarkable turnaround, and that was on the back of the economic reforms of the Hawke government, followed by the Keating government, which fundamentally changed the trajectory of the Australian economy. During that decade, incomes rose, real wages rose, employment rose, but from a horrible base because unemployment was very high through the 1991 recession. Jeff said some harsh words about neoliberalism, and I didn't feel sensitive about that because what Hawke was doing back in the 80s wasn't neoliberalism. The difference in the framework of policy could not have been more different from his contemporaries, who were Reagan in the United States from 1980 to 88 and Thatcher in the United Kingdom. What was different is that the Hawke reforms were in a social democratic framework where a major focus was on expanding education, medical facilities, social security, so that alongside liberalisation of the economy, which gave us stronger economic growth, stronger employment growth, stronger incomes growth, there was major redistribution through public policy. As a result, in that first decade of the long expansion, real incomes of ordinary Australians rose quite strongly. Very different from the America Reagan left. Real wages haven't increased in the United States since 1980. Real wages rose strongly in Australia through the 90s and up to about 2012. A very different situation. As a result, the American working class was ready to elect a Trump in 2016. Australians might have something that's not as different as we would like, but Morrison is not Trump. We're not there yet. But then after the productivity boom, Australian incomes kept rising from 2002 to 2012, but I call this period the China resources boom. The focus on improved economic performance, increased productivity stopped. I started writing in those years, 2003, 2004, about the great Australian complacency of the early 21st century, and that just continued. But the China resources boom was so powerful that it allowed Australian incomes to keep rising for another decade, even though there was no increase in productivity. Even wages continued to rise in that period, 2002 to 2012. China resources boom ended, well, it was broken, of course, for a while by the global financial crisis, but Australia had a huge fiscal and monetary expansion in response to that, the Rudd government, and it meant that we didn't have a recession. We were very unusual in the developed world. It was only us and Korea that didn't have a recession, and so unemployment did not rise in the global financial crisis the way that it had in 1991. But the China resources boom resumed a year after the global financial crisis because China did what we did, but on steroids. It was anxious to keep economic growth going. It made huge investments in infrastructure that increased demand for Australian products, and the boom continued in Australia. But the China boom ended in 2012 with a change in the model of Chinese economic growth, and we entered what I call the dog days. 2013 and continuing to the pandemic, I wrote a book called The Dog Days in 2013 that anticipated what was going to happen, and unfortunately spelling out what would happen unless we pulled up our socks didn't cause us to pull up our socks, so it all happened. In the dog days, 2013 to 2019, there was stagnation of real wages, no growth in average output per person. There was some increase in total income, but almost all going to high income earners, an increase in inequality. And in the labour market, we didn't have the very high unemployment that the rest of the world had after the global financial crisis, and stayed around 5 to 6%. 2013, it was a bit over 5%, and it just stayed there, 5%, right through from 2013 to the eve of the pandemic. In the United States, by contrast, there had been well over 10% unemployment during the global financial crisis. It had fallen, but was still 8.5% in 2013. And by 2019, it was fallen steadily to 3.5%, whereas ours had just stayed 5.5%, and no one in Australia was worried about it. No one was talking about there being a big problem of unemployment in Australia. The Reserve Bank, its Act of Parliament that established it was originally written into the Commonwealth Bank Act by the Chifley government, and then continued. The first legal obligation of the Reserve Bank of Australia is to maintain full employment. But there was no mention of full employment. The word does not appear in any of the monthly statements of monetary policy from 2013 until the eve of the pandemic. The difference between Australian policy, fiscal and monetary policy, budget policy and Reserve Bank's monetary policy during those years was the difference between our unemployment situation and that in the United States, for example. And worse than that, underemployment rose extraordinarily. The number of people who were counted as employed by the statistician, because you're employed if you work 1 hour, if you've worked 1 hour in the previous week, but the number of people who were employed but not working the number of hours they wanted to work just grew considerably during that period. So one of my messages in Reset was to say, we don't want to go back to where we were. We've got to do something better than that. To go back to where we were would be to invite the descent of Australia into Trumpism, and that's a horrible place to be. That's a place that threatens your democracy. I talk in the book a bit about the mistakes of policy and the problems of the political economy that gave rise to those mistakes, that gave us the dog days. But a lot of the problems were the downgrading of the role of knowledge in policy making, the reduction of the role of public discussion in the public interest, and the rise of the influence of vested interests in policy making, and the role of money in the political process. I think that was the central mistake, and that helped a lot of other mistakes to persist. There were two particular mistakes in the dog days that I drew attention to. One was a mistake in monetary policy. Monetary policy was just tighter than the level of unemployment justified, and I think it was a mistake to change the basis of Australian immigration. The successful post-war immigration program had been on the basis of permanent migration. People came, from the time they came, accepted as migrants, were on a path to becoming Australians and participated in Australian institutions, saw themselves as absorbing Australian values, joining trade unions, political parties. We shifted in the 21st century to much heavier emphasis on temporary migration of various kinds at a very high level, and that made it very difficult to establish full employment. It's one of the reasons we had stagnation of wages during that period. So that they were particular issues that we needed to address. Looking forward, I said that we would face a choice between whether we embraced post-pandemic restoration of Australia or post-pandemic dog days. It wasn't going to be easy to take the post-pandemic restoration course, and I pointed out that there are a number of periods in Australian history where we face similar choices. I pointed to 5 different periods. After World War I was one where the demobilisation of a huge number of people, mostly young men returning from war, was a very big challenge for the economy. We didn't really deal with that. We accumulated problems. We accumulated external debt during that period. We pushed, not facing the problems, we pushed the challenges forward to later periods. And then we were overtaken by the Great Depression. The economic problems of Australia were accumulating in advance of the Great Depression. Scullin was elected in '29 on the basis of the economy that was already in bad shape. The Depression came on top of that. And So the governments of the 30s faced very large challenges dealing with the Great Depression. I say that we half faced up to that. We actually did better than the United States and the UK. We didn't do anywhere near as well as we could have. So the 20s, we didn't face up to the problems at all. The 30s, we half faced up to them. Next big challenge was the demobilisation after the Second World War, where there were fears, even expectations, that we would go back to the chronic unemployment and difficulties of the 1920s. And the response to that was the chiefly, first of all, the Curtin government's establishment of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction while the war was still at its height. A clever young fellow, Nugget Coombs, made head of the department. He brought in a younger fellow, John Crawford, as the director of research in that department. And the reform program that started to be designed under Curtin and was then completed under Chifley was far-reaching. Some of the main essence encapsulated in the white paper on full employment, published immediately after the war. Janet tells me we're about to celebrate the 75th anniversary, which was actually during the pandemic, but we'll celebrate a late 75th anniversary of that. But that was so successful that Menzies, a conservative who didn't want to upset things that seemed to be okay, continued all of the main features of policy. Nugget Coombs recounts in his autobiography that he received a message from Canberra. He was down at the Commonwealth Bank in Sydney, received a message from Canberra the day after the 49 election to come and see the Prime Minister. And this is the story he tells us. I presume he tells the truth in his biography. He said he entered the office expecting that he was going to be dismissed because he was so closely associated with the Labor government. And Menzies looked up at him and said, can you give us full employment with low inflation? And Nugget says, he said, yes. And Menzies said, well, you do that and you won't hear much from me. And so Nugget, to his surprise, walked out of the door, still governor of the Commonwealth Bank, and drove back to Sydney. It was slower to wait for a plane in those days than to drive back. So that was a remarkable success story that changed Australia, that gave us a quarter century of full employment with low inflation. It fell apart with the international shocks, and one must say the ill attention to economic policy of a great Prime Minister in the 70s, and we entered deep recession in 74, 75, nowhere near as deep as subsequent recessions, but it was deep compared with what we'd had back to the Second World War. The problems of that time weren't dealt with until 83. So that's another example of the 20s, of the problems not being addressed. And unemployment stayed high under Fraser, inflation stayed high, the problems just weren't dealt with, and it became the job of the Hawke government, which Gareth and Brian were important members to address the problems left over from Fraser. And that was another period of brilliant success. It gave us an extraordinary expansion of the 90s and early 21st century to which I've referred, but did a lot of other things as well. It gave us Medicare, universal health. It increased the number of kids completing high school from about 36% to about 3/4, hugely expanded tertiary education, gave us family payments on a generally available basis for the first time. It gave us a social democracy in a way that Australia hadn't had before. Well, we're facing another one of these now, and I am afraid that we've we seem for the moment to have chosen to post-pandemic dog days. Let's see if we'll change that choice in the near future. Well, what would restoration of Australia, what would that choice involve? It first of all would involve a change in the fiscal and monetary policy that it gave us unnecessarily high inflation, unemployment and stagnant wages through the dog days. Now the good news there is, I presume the Governor had some of his bright young officers listening in to the reset lectures, but whether or not that was causally important, the Reserve Bank started talking about full employment after a decade of not mentioning full employment, and now every monthly report talks about full employment. Recently we've had the Treasurer say that one of his aims is to go back to full employment like in the days of Menzies. He attributed it to Menzies, and that's fair enough because he continued with Nugget Coombs and the policies of Curtin and Chifley. So that's a very big change. There's been a radical change of monetary policy. We ran tighter monetary policy than countries with stronger economies than ours through the dog days, but we went back to the sort of monetary policies, interest rates near zero, the Reserve Bank borrowing most of the new debt the government was taking up, effectively lending, but buying most of the new debt the Commonwealth was issuing. So a radical change in both fiscal and monetary policy. Deficits, after having been a great source of concern, a fetish for a long period, became a matter of no consequence. Well, if you're going to run very big deficits like we have the last couple of years, it's a chance to buy some productive change. And I suggested that this was a good time to introduce some important tax changes that would cost a lot to begin with, but over time give economic effects that would pay back a fair bit of the lost revenue. So they would be perfectly shaped for the recessionary circumstance that we had. We had to run a deficit anyway, so why not spend $40 billion introducing a minimum basic income or a negative income tax, which gives you a lot of that back later on because it removes disincentives to participate in the labour force, which will allow the expansion of the economy. Once you've got full employment, increases in labour force participation become critically important for expanding the economy. They're not so important when you've got high employment. If more people want to work when you've got unemployment, you may not be actually expanding employment. But when you've got full employment, and that should be the objective of the reset, then it will matter again whether people are working the number of hours that they want to work. So I propose that now is the time for that reform. Another reform I thought was very important is changing the basis of our corporate income tax from accounting profit, which provides huge opportunities for avoidance and which favours companies that don't innovate, that don't invest, that avoid taxes with large imports of services, unnecessarily high debt, changing from that base to a base of cash flow, which puts much more of the tax burden on those companies that are not investing, not innovating, takes tax away from companies that are doing those things. That would cost a lot at the beginning, but we would get it back later on. I thought this was a very good time to do that. Well, we'll end up in a couple of years' time with $1 trillion of Commonwealth debt, a number that we would have thought inconceivable a few years ago, 10 times as much as the peak that was reached after the global financial crisis, for which the Rudd and Gillard governments were most heavily criticised, and unless we do something different from now on, we'll have nothing to show for it. We would have kept things going. We would have avoided a lot of pain from deeper recession last year, but we won't have built structures that give us a better Australia in future. So there are two basic tax changes that I thought would be timely. And the other big change would be to embrace the superpower opportunity. Well, that's the book I published in 2019. Also began as half a dozen public lectures through the University of Melbourne. But I pointed out there that Australia was in first it had a stronger interest in dealing with climate change than any other developed country. We were the most vulnerable country to climate change. I told that story in the Climate Change Review of 2008. And then secondly, while we were the biggest exporter of coal and liquefied natural gas, and these exports would disappear, we had an even bigger advantage in the new sources of energy than in the coal and gas that are so important now. And not only was our advantage bigger, but it was advantage that would give a benefit for our manufacturing industries and other industries, because although we've got the best metallurgical coal in the world, it's available to steel mills in Kobe or Shanghai or Busan at about the same price as in Port Kembla, and actually at a cheaper price than in Whyalla, because it's cheap to transport coal across international borders. But when the whole world is using renewable energy, solar and wind energy, it's actually very expensive to take it by submarine cable to the Asian mainland. You can do it, it will be done, it will be quite a big export industry, but it's going to be more than twice as expensive at the other end. If you turn it into hydrogen and send the hydrogen to Japan to turn into steel and using hydrogen instead of coal, the hydrogen will be more than twice as expensive in Japan as it is here. So Australia will be the place, the economically natural place to turn Australian minerals into products. That's what normal economics will lead us to if we don't muck it up. Embracing this opportunity could be a very important part of the reset, the restoring Australia for full employment, return to rising income, and a more equitable distribution of income. I'll leave it there and very happy to answer questions, Sarah.